One night in 1973, Madison Square Garden shook like it had never before. When Led Zeppelin walked on stage, they weren't just another rock band. They were about to prove they were untouchable. By the time the lights came back on, the world saw them differently. That night, Zeppelin became rock gods. A band on the brink. By the summer of 1973, Led Zeppelin wasn't just a successful band, they were a phenomenon. Their fourth album, featuring the untitled masterpiece often simply called Led Zeppelin IV, had cemented their place in rock history. Tracks like Stairway to Heaven dominated radios, teenagers scrawled Zeppelin symbols onto their school notebooks, and stadiums filled to the brim every time their name appeared on a ticket stub. To their fans, Zeppelin were already giants. But to the critical establishment, they were still outsiders clawing for legitimacy. Unlike the Beatles, who were praised as pop culture innovators, or the Rolling Stones, who wore their bad boy label with critical approval, Zeppelin's reputation was far more complicated. Some critics sneered that they were just a loud blues cover band. Others accused them of being excessive, too many solos, too much volume, too much ego. The music press of the early 70s was notoriously hostile, and Zeppelin was a frequent target. Robert Plant once admitted it felt like they were at war with the media, constantly having to defend their artistry. At the same time, their lifestyle was becoming part of the legend. Stories circulated of wild hotel parties, destroyed rooms, and rowdy antics on the road. To some, they were living proof of rock and roll excess. To others, these stories overshadowed their music, fueling the perception that Zeppelin were more chaos than craft. That was the paradox they carried into Madison Square Garden, adored by millions, dismissed by elites, and still hungry for validation. And then there was the pressure of America itself. Britain had birthed Zeppelin, but the United States was where a band's fate was truly sealed. The U.S. was the biggest market, the most competitive stage, and New York City, the country's cultural capital, was where reputations could be made or broken. For Zeppelin, conquering Madison Square Garden meant more than filling seats. It meant silencing every critic who doubted them, and proving they could hold their own alongside the Stones, the Who, and every American superstar of the era. Behind the scenes, tension buzzed within the band. The grind of constant touring, the temptations of fame, and the weight of expectation wore heavily. Jimmy Page, the mastermind guitarist, had been pushing the band into darker, more experimental territory. Robert Plant's voice, golden and untamed, was under pressure to deliver night after night. John Bonham's drumming, powerful but punishing, tested his stamina. John Paul Jones, the quiet anchor, carried the responsibility of balancing the storm. They were at the height of their powers, but they were also stretched thin. It's what made Madison Square Garden so dangerous and so crucial. This wasn't just another concert. It was a make-or-break moment. If they triumphed, they would crush every lingering doubt and rise above criticism forever. If they failed, the whispers of arrogance and excess would only grow louder. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Zeppelin knew it. And when the lights went down, they were ready to prove they weren't just a band. They were destiny. The weight of Madison Square Garden. In the world of rock and roll, there were plenty of big arenas, but none carried the cultural gravity of Madison Square Garden. Built in the heart of Manhattan, MSG wasn't just a venue. It was a proving ground. To play there wasn't enough. To matter, you had to own it. For artists, it symbolized a moment when your career wasn't just popular. It was historic. Elvis Presley had stunned New York there the year before. The Rolling Stones had roared through, reaffirming their dominance. And now, in July 1973, Led Zeppelin was stepping into that same arena with something to prove. For Zeppelin, the stakes were even higher, because New York wasn't just another city. It was America's gatekeeper. If you conquered New York, the rest of the country followed. And New York audiences weren't easy to impress. They were notorious for their intensity, quick to applaud, quicker to boo, and unflinching in their judgment. Playing Madison Square Garden was like walking into a lion's den with the world watching. The buzz leading up to the shows was electric. Tickets had disappeared within hours of going on sale, and resale prices soared. Fans camped outside, lined the streets, and scalped tickets for small fortunes. The anticipation wasn't just for a concert, it was for a spectacle. Everyone in the city seemed to know that Zeppelin was coming, and whispers echoed in bars, subway stations, and college dorms. Could they live up to the hype? Backstage, the crew scrambled to prepare for a production on a scale few had seen before. The lighting rigs were massive, the amplifiers towered like monuments, and the sound checks shook the empty arena like thunder. Even before the band appeared, you could feel history pressing down on the venue, as if the garden itself demanded a performance worthy of its reputation. And then there was the atmosphere outside the arena. The streets were jammed with fans who couldn't get tickets but refused to miss the moment. Police struggled to manage crowds spilling over into avenues, while vendors hawked bootleg t-shirts and posters. For New York, this wasn't just another night of rock music, it was a cultural event, a statement that something unforgettable was about to unfold. By the time the lights dimmed and the first roar of the crowd erupted, the energy inside Madison Square Garden wasn't just excitement, it was expectation. Zeppelin was walking into a crucible, and every note they played would be judged against the legends who came before them. And when they finally took the stage, the challenge was clear. This was no longer about being popular, this was about becoming immortal. The night they took over. The lights dropped, and for a brief second, Madison Square Garden was swallowed in darkness. Then came the roar, not from the band, but from the crowd itself. Thousands of voices fused into one sound, a primal surge of energy demanding the show begin. When Jimmy Page's guitar sliced through the noise with the opening riff of Rock and Roll, the garden erupted. This wasn't just a concert, it was an eruption. Robert Plant strutted across the stage with an aura somewhere between a golden-haired demigod and a blues preacher. His voice soared above the wall of sound, piercing through the chaos like a siren's call. Jimmy Page's guitar snarled and wept, bending notes until they felt supernatural. John Paul Jones stood steady, his bass lines weaving order into madness, while John Bonham unleashed drumming so powerful it shook the rafters. Every beat felt like a physical blow, chest-rattling, unstoppable, a force of nature. The setlist was ambitious, blending their biggest hits with sprawling improvisations. Black Dog sent the crowd into a frenzy, Plant's call and response teasing fans into screams. Stairway to Heaven became more than a song. It was a spiritual rite, with the audience hanging on every note of Page's solo. But what made the night unforgettable was the unpredictability. Songs stretched beyond recognition, expanding into 20-minute odysseys, where the band seemed to enter another dimension. Dazed and confused, transformed into a surreal journey, with Page bowing his guitar like a shaman summoning spirits, green lasers slicing through the dark, as if the garden itself were under a spell. Even the quieter moments carried weight. When Plant introduced Since I've Been Loving You, the atmosphere shifted from bombast to raw intimacy. His voice cracked with pain, every lyric dripping with longing, while Page's guitar moaned in response. For those in the crowd, it felt like witnessing the private agony of a man laid bare in front of 20,000 strangers. But nothing matched the intensity of John Bonham's solo on Moby Dick. For nearly 20 minutes, he battered his kit with bare hands, sticks flying, sweat pouring, his body a blur of energy. The crowd, instead of tiring, grew louder with every strike, chanting his name as if he were a warrior in battle. By the time he finally crashed to a finish, Bonham wasn't just a drummer, he was a legend. Throughout it all, the audience didn't just watch, they lived it. Some screamed until their voices broke, others cried, couples clutched each other as if bracing against a storm. People later swore they could feel the garden itself tremble, as if the building were struggling to contain the sheer force of the performance. And when Zeppelin finally closed with Whole Lotta Love, the eruption was so intense it felt like the walls themselves were ready to give way. By the end, the band didn't just leave the stage, they left New York transformed. But as triumphant as it seemed, the chaos off stage was just as unforgettable. Shadows of Chaos. As fans poured out of Madison Square Garden convinced they had seen gods on stage, a very different story was unfolding behind the curtain. For Zeppelin, the night wasn't just triumph, it was tangled in shadows. Just hours after the final show, chaos struck. On July 29, 1973, the band discovered that their safe deposit box at the Drake Hotel had been emptied of more than $200,000 in cash. Money from the Madison Square Garden shows that was supposed to cover expenses. The heist stunned everyone. How could such a massive sum vanish from one of New York's most secure hotels? Theories spread instantly. Some whispered about mob involvement, pointing out that New York in the 70s was still deeply entangled with organized crime. Others suggested it was an inside job, carried out by someone close enough to know exactly when and where the cash was being kept. To this day, the crime remains unsolved, cementing the mystery in Zeppelin's mythology. The robbery wasn't just a headline. It added to the sense that Zeppelin carried a storm cloud wherever they went. For all their brilliance on stage, their off-stage world was defined by danger, indulgence, and unpredictability. At Madison Square Garden, they weren't just fighting critics. They were battling themselves. Tensions within the band were real. Jimmy Page's relentless drive for perfection pushed everyone to their limits. Robert Plant, despite his golden charisma, was already feeling the strain on his voice after years of screaming through marathon tours. John Bonham's drinking habits were becoming more notorious, his legendary drumming matched only by his appetite for excess. And John Paul Jones, the quiet anchor, often found himself stuck between chaos and order, trying to hold it all together. Add to this the sheer pressure of their lifestyle, constant touring, endless demands, the temptation of drugs, alcohol, and a never-ending parade of parties. Zeppelin had become symbols of rock excess, their offstage antics fueling the same headlines that dismissed their artistry. Critics claimed their music was drowned out by their reputation. Fans whispered stories of destruction in hotel rooms, of motorcycles roaring down hallways, of debauchery that sounded more like myth than reality. And yet, for Zeppelin, this was their normal. Even on those MSG nights as the crowd worshipped them, the band knew they were walking a razor's edge. One wrong step, one collapse under pressure, and it could all unravel. The robbery was more than just a financial loss. It was a metaphor for their world. On stage, they seemed untouchable. Off stage, they were vulnerable, surrounded by shadows that followed them everywhere. And yet, as chaotic as it all was, the aftermath of Madison Square Garden only amplified their legend. Shaking the world. When the final echoes of Whole Lotta Love faded and the garden lights came back on, New York didn't simply applaud, it buzzed. Word of mouth spread like wildfire through the city. For fans who had been inside, it was the kind of night you told your children about. For those who hadn't, it became a story they wished they could have lived. Madison Square Garden had witnessed history, and the aftershock was immediate. The press, which had long been skeptical of Zeppelin, suddenly couldn't look away. The New York Times, which had once dismissed them as bombastic noise merchants, wrote with newfound respect, noting the sheer power of the performances. Even critics who remained snide admitted the shows couldn't be ignored. Zeppelin had sold out 3 nights at the world's most famous arena, delivered with a force no one else could match, and walked away as the undisputed rulers of the rock world. But the true proof of their impact came not from journalists, but from the fans themselves. Bootleg recordings of the MSG shows began to circulate almost instantly. Scratchy tapes were passed from hand to hand, traded like sacred relics among collectors. Young fans wore out cassette players just to relive the thunder of Bonham's drums or the soaring cry of Plant's vocals. For many, those rough recordings were the closest they would ever get to feeling the garden shake in 1973. Bootlegs transformed the MSG concerts into legend, keeping the experience alive long after the final note. The shows also sent shockwaves through the industry. Rival bands, even those at the top of their game, suddenly realized Zeppelin had raised the bar. The Rolling Stones may have been kings of cool, and The Who may have been masters of destruction, but Zeppelin had just proven they could outplay and outdraw them all. Promoters scrambled to book them in bigger venues. Fans demanded more dates. Zeppelin had gone from being just another big band to a cultural juggernaut no one could deny. And the numbers backed it up. After MSG, sales of Houses of the Holy surged. Tickets for the rest of their tour vanished faster than ever before. Zeppelin didn't just play Madison Square Garden. They owned it, and in doing so, they rewrote their own reputation. They weren't chasing approval anymore. They had forced the world to see them on their terms. What lingered wasn't just applause, but awe. Zeppelin had taken the crown, and soon, Their MSG triumph would be immortalized forever on film. Immortality on film. What made the Madison Square Garden concerts truly immortal wasn't just the thunder that shook the arena in July 1973, it was the fact that those nights were captured on film. Months later, fans would discover that the band's MSG performances had been recorded and spliced into what became The Song Remains the Same, Zeppelin's first official concert film. At the time, concert films weren't new, but Zeppelin's approach was unlike anything audiences had seen. This wasn't simply a live show on screen. It was mythology. The film, released in 1976, combined footage from the MSG concerts with bizarre fantasy sequences that reflected each band member's persona. Page as a mystical figure wandering through mountains, Plant as a medieval hero, Bonham as a working-class warrior behind the wheel, and Jones shrouded in Gothic imagery. Critics were divided. Some argued the dreamlike interludes distracted from the raw power of the concerts. But for fans, the film was gospel. It offered a chance to relive the magic of MSG, or, for those who hadn't been there, to finally see it. For a generation that hadn't been able to score a ticket, The Song Remains the Same became their portal into the night. Zeppelin became gods. The soundtrack album of the film sold millions, further amplifying the legend. Suddenly, even fans in small towns who had never set foot in New York could drop a needle on the record and feel the roar of the garden. Bootlegs and rumors had already kept the shows alive, but the official film sealed it. MSG 73 wasn't just a concert. It became canon, a central chapter in Zeppelin's mythos. And the influence rippled outward. Young musicians who saw the film walked away changed. Many later admitted it was the moment they decided to pick up a guitar, start a band, or chase the impossible dream of filling arenas themselves. For them, Zeppelin at MSG wasn't just entertainment, it was a blueprint for greatness. Even decades later, the MSG shows remain shorthand for what it means to be larger than life. When people call Zeppelin rock gods, they're often thinking of that exact imagery. Plant in the spotlight, Page bowing his guitar, Bonham pounding the drums into the earth, Jones steady in the storm. Madison Square Garden became their temple, and The Song Remains the Same turned that temple into scripture. And yet, as immortal as it all seemed, one question still lingers in the shadows of history. Would Zeppelin have been seen as gods without that night? That night at Madison Square Garden wasn't just a concert. It was the moment Led Zeppelin seized immortality. From challengers to rock gods, they walked off that stage untouchable. And decades later, the world still talks about it. If you love stories where legends, lyrics, and history collide, make sure to subscribe to Backstage Melody, where the music never fades and the myths live on.